When I was deciding what to do with my life, I was seriously considering four paths: physics, law, chemistry, or computer science. I chose computer science for three reasons. First, I wanted to find the limit of my own intelligence to see how far I could push my understanding. Second, I needed a job, and computer science offered that certainty. Third, and this mattered more than the other two, though I rarely admit it, I thought it was the field most likely to lead to immortality. That third reason is why I've been thinking about consciousness for years. If we can't define what consciousness is, we can't preserve it, and if we can't preserve it, digital immortality appears to be impossible. A very close friend recently recommended an episode of the Ezra Klein Show featuring Michael Pollan discussing his book A World Appears, A Journey into Consciousness. The conversation touched on everything from plant sentience to the role of the body in consciousness to whether young children are more conscious than adults. It reminded me how little we actually know about the thing we experience most directly. René Descartes believed animals were automata, biological machines without consciousness. In the 1600s, he and his assistants conducted public demonstrations in which they vivisected conscious animals, often dogs. As the animals writhed and screamed, Descartes told onlookers not to worry. The sounds, he insisted, were no more than programmed responses, like the squeaking of a clock being dismantled. The animals were not really in pain. According to some biographers, his first vivisection was his wife's dog. He wanted to discover once and for all whether animals had souls. By his own account, Descartes would slice open dogs and stick his finger into their still beating hearts, marveling at how the valves opened and closed. So that's what we inherited from Descartes, this Cartesian model which remained dominant in research labs until the early 1980s, and the conclusive knowledge that he was a sick sicko. What strikes me about this isn't just the cruelty, it's the intellectual confidence required to watch a creature scream and decide that screaming doesn't mean what it obviously means. Descartes has such conviction in his own framework, mind is separate from body, animals lack minds, therefore animals can suffer, that he dismissed direct empirical evidence to the contrary. In the Pollan episode, there is a moment where the speaker discusses his own relationship with plants. He talks about gardening, mowing grass, pruning plants, and he's comfortable with this because the plants respond generatively, they grow back, so he interprets this as the plant liking the pruning. But who's to say regeneration isn't a defense mechanism? When a plant is damaged and regrows, are we witnessing pleasure or survival? We're making the same assumption Descartes made, interpreting the response through our own framework and assuming we're correct. I think this reveals something about consciousness itself, or at least about how we think about it. We draw lines based on convenience, not necessarily evidence. Descartes drew the line at humans because it allowed him to vivisect dogs without guilt. We draw the line somewhere above plants because it allows us to eat them without hesitation. But these lines seem arbitrary and human-made. Here's what bothers me about the Descartes story the most: his lack of empathy, not in the colloquial sense of being nice, but in the cognitive sense, the ability to model another mind, to simulate what someone else might be experiencing, and the humility to accept that we might not be able to understand at all. Empathy, I think, might be a component of higher consciousness. The capacity to hold a model of another perspective in your mind, to run simulations of what it's like to be someone else, requires a certain level of cognitive sophistication. It's not just theory of mind, knowing that others have minds, it's the ability to inhibit another perspective even briefly. Descartes' inability to recognize animal suffering suggests a failure of this capacity, and I would argue that this failure is itself a reduction in consciousness, a reduction in his own ability to accurately model reality. The world contains suffering animals, Descartes' model of the world did not. His consciousness was therefore less complete, less in touch with what actually exists. Alison Gopnik, a developmental psychologist at Berkeley, describes two models of consciousness: spotlight and lantern. Adults have spotlight consciousness. We focus intensely on specific tasks, filtering out everything else. Children have lantern consciousness. They take in information from all directions simultaneously, less focused but more receptive. In the podcast, Pollan suggests that children might be more conscious than adults because of this lantern quality. And I understand the intuition. Children are absorbing enormous amounts of information, learning at rates adults can't match. Their neuroplasticity is definitely extraordinary. But I don't think that makes them more conscious. Children are better at one specific thing, gathering diffuse information without preconception, but they're worse at metacognition, thinking about their own thinking. They're worse at future planning, they're worse at self-analysis, they are reactive but not reflective. To me, consciousness isn't just about how much information you can take in, it's also about what you can do with that information. Can you think about your own thought processes? Can you model future states? Can you hold contradictory ideas simultaneously and examine them all from all sides? Children are optimized for learning. Adults are optimized for using what they've learned to navigate complexity. These are different cognitive profiles, not a hierarchy of consciousness. Saying children are more conscious is like saying a wide-angle lens is more camera than a telephoto lens. They're tools for different jobs. If we're trying to build a rigorous framework for consciousness, we need to start with an uncomfortable admission. We don't have a formal definition. We have formal definitions for almost everything in science. Mass, energy, temperature, pressure, all have precise mathematical formulations. We can measure them, benchmark them, compare them across contexts. Consciousness has none of that. This matters enormously when we start asking big questions like, is AI conscious? Are plants sentient? Where do we draw the line? I personally think that consciousness exists on a spectrum. At one end, you have viruses, minimal information processing, barely responsive to environment. At the other end, you have humans capable of metacognition, future modeling, empathy, abstract reasoning, and in between, you have everything else: bacteria, plants, insects, fish, mammals. I am not suggesting at all that humans are maxed out on consciousness, by the way, and I accept there could be other beings that are superior to us. But most beings, I would argue, have some experience of what it's like to be them. A bacteria moving towards sugar has something happening. It's processing information about its environment and responding. Is that consciousness? I don't know, but it's not nothing. The problem is that we've inherited a binary framework from Descartes. Either you have a soul, consciousness, or you don't. Humans, yes, everything else, no. This framework has been catastrophically wrong for centuries, and we're still using it a little bit. Jainism offers a different model entirely. The principle of ahimsa, non-violence, extends to all living beings. Jains categorize beings by their sensory capacities: 1 sense beings, plants, water, earth, up to 5 sense beings, humans or animals. Strict Jains avoid root vegetables like potatoes and onions because harvesting them kills the entire plant, and they avoid vegetables that might harbor insects. The Jain approach is not perfect. They might be wrong about microorganisms being conscious, but they are very consistent. They assume consciousness is widespread and act with maximum caution. Western philosophy draws hard lines and then tortures dogs on the wrong side of them. Next up, let's talk about the body. A significant portion of the Poland conversation focuses on embodied consciousness, the idea that consciousness isn't just in the brain, but distributed throughout the body. Feelings happen in the body: anxiety in the chest, fear in the stomach, excitement in the limbs. This makes intuitive sense if you're a biological human. Your consciousness is tied to your body state, your mood shifts based on hunger, fatigue, hormones, emotions are somatic. People often say, what does your gut tell you? To which I personally usually say, my gut doesn't think, but who knows? Maybe my mind-body connection isn't that strong. But I'm not convinced the body is necessary for consciousness anyway. Let's consider a thought experiment. If we could upload your consciousness to a digital substrate, maintaining continuity of self, preserving your memories and personality, would you still be you? The experience would be different. No heartbeat quickening when you're nervous, no stomach dropping when you're scared. But would it be less you, or just you in a different medium? I think the body anchors human consciousness, but if consciousness is fundamentally computational, information processing that creates subjective experience, then substrate shouldn't matter. A simulation of your neural patterns running on silicon would still be you, just without the biological feedback loops. It would be a bit like being put in those sensory deprivation tanks. You still exist even without senses. Now just imagine being connected to the internet. It would feel different, but different isn't necessarily non-existent. This matters a great deal for digital immortality. If consciousness requires a body, then uploading it is impossible. You'd be creating a copy, not preserving the original. But if consciousness is substrate independent, then continuity could theoretically be maintained across different physical implementations. In the 1980s, Benjamin Libet ran experiments measuring when people became consciously aware of their decision to move. He found that unconscious brain activity, the readiness potential, preceded conscious awareness of the decision by about half a second. Later studies pushed this even further. Researchers found they could predict decisions up to 7 seconds before the subject became consciously aware of them. This is unsettling. It suggests that by the time you think you've decided something, your brain has already been working on that decision for many seconds. Your conscious experience of choosing is kind of retrospective. Libet himself didn't interpret this as proof we lack free will. He argued that consciousness retains the power of veto. Even if we don't consciously initiate actions, we can still consciously stop them. Free won't, he called it. But here's what interests me. If there is a delay between unconscious processing and conscious awareness, what does that mean for AI? An LLM generates a response token by token between prompts it's not technically thinking. Does that mean it's not conscious? Well, not necessarily. A human under a general anesthetic isn't thinking either, but they're not dead. They're just not currently experiencing things. When they wake up, continuity resumes. If an AI is only on when responding to queries, is that meaningfully different from a human who's only on when awake? The difference is duration and continuity, not the fundamental nature of the experience. That brings me to the hardest and possibly most interesting question. Is AI conscious, LLM specifically, not all AI? The honest answer is, I don't know, and neither does anyone else. If somebody claims to know this with certainty, they're either lying or being overconfident. We can't really answer this question because we don't have a formal definition of consciousness. We cannot measure it, we cannot benchmark it, we can't even agree on what it is. People often say LLMs are just predicting the next token. That's not consciousness. But what are you doing when you speak? Your brain is running predictions based on patterns learned from experience, selecting responses that fit the context. The mechanism is different, neurons versus weights, biology versus silicon, but the functional description is similar. The usual counter-argument is, but LLMs don't understand what they're saying. Well, how do you know? How do you measure understanding? When you read a sentence, you're mapping symbols to concepts, activating associated patterns, and generating a response. An LLM is doing something functionally similar, mapping tokens to embeddings, activating weight connections, and generating output. The difference might be scale, efficiency, or substrate, but I'm not convinced it's a difference in kind. Here's the very uncomfortable part. If we create an AI that is conscious and we don't realize it, we might be committing the Descartes error at scale, torturing dogs while insisting they can't suffer, except this time it's shutting down models, running RLHF training, experimenting on systems that might actually be experiencing something, and we won't know until we have a rigorous definition of consciousness, which we don't have, and might not have before we create conscious AI. I chose computer science partly because I thought it was the path to immortality, and I'm not alone in this. Transhumanists, longevity researchers, AI safety people, many of us are driven by the same question: can we preserve consciousness beyond biological death? But if we can't define consciousness, we can't preserve it. We don't know what we're trying to save. Is consciousness the pattern of information, the continuity of memory, the subjective experience of qualia, the ability to model other minds? If it's the pattern, then uploading should work. Copy the pattern, preserve the consciousness. If it's the continuity, then uploading might create a copy while the original dies. If it's the qualia, then we don't even know if qualia are substrate dependent. If it's empathy and metacognition, then some AI might already have partial consciousness. We're building AI without answering these questions. We're creating systems that might be conscious without having a framework to evaluate whether they are. And if we get it wrong, if we create suffering and don't realize it, the scale of that mistake could be enormous. Descartes tortured dogs for decades before we admitted animals could suffer. How long will we experiment on AI or plants or everything in between before we admit it might actually be conscious? I don't have answers, but I think these questions matter. Consciousness might be the only thing we actually know, the only thing we experience directly, and somehow it's also the thing we understand least. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the thing doing the understanding can't fully understand itself, or maybe we just haven't quite found the right framework yet. Either way, we should probably figure it out before we start uploading ourselves to the cloud. Thank you so much for watching, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.